Nigerian fighter jets didn't just strike bandits. They waited until they gathered to bury their dead, then obliterated them. 23 militants. Gone. Not by luck, by design. This wasn't war as you know it. This was something Nigeria has never done before, hunting criminals across state lines, in real time, with no mercy and no pause. And if you think this is just another military operation, you're missing what's actually happening. Because what started in Kano isn't staying in Kano. It's a blueprint. And every armed group in West Africa just realized the rules have changed. At the dawn of 2026, Nigerian military forces crushed a large-scale bandit incursion in Kano State, not just repelling the attack, but pursuing the retreating militants across state lines into Katsina using advanced surveillance technology. This wasn't a reactive skirmish. It was a coordinated demonstration of a new military doctrine, and it signals a pivotal shift in how Nigeria intends to handle the insurgency consuming its northwest. For years, bandit groups have exploited the porous borders between Nigeria's northern states, launching raids on villages, kidnapping civilians for ransom, and vanishing into the vast, ungoverned spaces that stretch across Zamfara, Katsina, and Kaduna. These groups operate with near impunity, slipping between jurisdictions where coordination is weak and intelligence is often outdated. The result has been a sustained humanitarian catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands displaced, schools shuttered, farmland abandoned. The Nigerian state has struggled to assert control over its own territory, and public confidence in the military's ability to protect citizens has eroded steadily. But what happened in Shannono and Taya on January 1st wasn't business as usual. When bandits launched their coordinated assault, they expected the familiar pattern: overwhelm local defenses, loot what they could, and disappear before reinforcements arrived. Instead, they encountered a military already waiting, one that had anticipated their movements using intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets. ISR technology allowed Nigerian forces to track the bandits in real time as they fled northeast into Katsina, denying them the sanctuary they relied on for years. This is where the implications become clear. The operation wasn't just about winning a firefight. It was about erasing the strategic advantage bandits have held since this crisis began: mobility without accountability. Nigeria's deployment of ISR capabilities marks a doctrinal evolution. For decades, the military's counterinsurgency efforts in the northeast against Boko Haram and ISWAP have leaned heavily on air power and technology, including drones and satellite surveillance. But the Northwest banditry crisis has remained a stubbornly different problem: fragmented, decentralized, and tied to local grievances over land, cattle, and political neglect. Military responses have often been reactive, grinding, and unable to prevent the next wave of violence. The Kano operation suggests that lessons learned from the Boko Haram theater are now being applied to the Northwest. If sustained, this could fundamentally alter the calculus for armed groups operating in the region. Yet the question remains: is this a strategic breakthrough or a tactical demonstration that can't be scaled? ISR assets are expensive, limited, and require skilled operators. Nigeria's defense budget is constrained, and corruption within the military procurement system has historically undermined operational effectiveness. The ability to track and strike bandits across state lines is impressive, but only if it becomes standard practice rather than an isolated success. If this operation was a proof of concept, the real test will be whether the military can maintain this tempo and extend coverage across the sprawling theaters of northern Nigeria, where banditry thrives. There's also a political dimension at play. Governor Abba Kabir Yusuf of Kano has been under intense pressure to address insecurity in his state, and the success of this operation provides him with a narrative of competence and control. Kano is Nigeria's second-largest city and a critical economic hub. Any perception that the state is losing ground to bandits threatens investment, commerce, and political stability. The military's intervention bolsters the governor's position, but it also raises uncomfortable questions about the autonomy of state governments in managing security crises. Is this a model of federal-state coordination, or evidence that local authorities remain dependent on Abuja's military apparatus to maintain order. Nigerian military jets struck a bandit encampment near Danmake village just as militants gathered to bury their dead, killing at least 23 fighters and obliterating their weapons cache in a single coordinated airstrike. This wasn't collateral damage or a lucky hit. It was a calculated escalation, timed to strike when the enemy was most vulnerable, and it marks a fundamental shift in how Nigeria is prosecuting its war against armed groups in the Northwest. The strike came hours after bandits had already been driven out of Kano State following their failed assault on Shannono and Taya. As they fled across state lines into Katsina, Nigerian forces didn't just pursue them on the ground. They tracked their movements from the air, monitoring where they regrouped, where they planned to rearm, and, crucially, where they felt safe enough to lower their guard. The decision to strike during a burial gathering reveals something critical about the military's operational mindset. There are no pauses anymore. No sanctuaries. No moments of rest for armed groups that have terrorized northern Nigeria for years. This is where the doctrine becomes visible. For much of the banditry crisis, Nigeria's military response has been reactive and fragmented. Bandits would hit a village, disappear into the bush, and re-emerge weeks later somewhere else. State governments negotiated amnesties that collapsed within months. Local militias formed, only to become part of the problem themselves. The cycle repeated endlessly, and the population paid the price in blood and displacement. But the Danmake airstrike signals a departure from that pattern. It demonstrates that the Nigerian air component of Operation Fansan is now actively integrating intelligence, surveillance, and air power into a unified kill chain, one designed not just to repel attacks, but to systematically dismantle the networks that enable them. The significance of destroying motorcycles and weapons alongside personnel cannot be overstated. Bandit groups in the Northwest are highly mobile, often operating across vast ungoverned territories on motorbikes that allow them to strike quickly and vanish before reinforcements arrive. Motorcycles aren't just transportation. They're the logistical backbone of banditry in this region. By targeting these assets alongside fighters, the military is degrading the operational capacity of these groups in a way that ground offensives alone cannot achieve. You remove the mobility, you remove the impunity. Yet the timing raises uncomfortable questions. Striking a group during a burial is legally and morally defensible if those present are armed combatants actively engaged in hostilities. But it's also the kind of tactic that generates controversy. International humanitarian law permits targeting combatants at any time, but public perception matters, especially in regions where trust between communities and the military is already fragile. The Nigerian military will need to manage the narrative carefully, ensuring that operations like Danmake are understood as precision strikes against active threats, not indiscriminate violence. If local populations begin to view these operations as reckless or excessive, it risks alienating the very communities whose cooperation is essential for long-term stability. There's also a broader strategic calculation at play. By demonstrating the ability to track, pursue, and strike bandit groups across state lines with coordinated ground and air assets, Nigeria is sending a message not just to the militants, but to regional governors, international observers, and neighboring countries. This is a state reasserting control over territory it has struggled to govern. It's a signal that the federal government is willing to commit serious military resources to the Northwest, a theater that has long been overshadowed by the Boko Haram insurgency in the Northeast. The question is whether this level of intensity can be sustained, or whether it represents a temporary surge designed to regain momentum before resources are stretched thin again. Show more. 11:39 a.m. Nigeria just demonstrated that it's no longer waiting for bandits to strike first, and the implications of that shift could reshape security operations across West Africa. In Kano State, the military didn't just repel an attack and claim victory. It tracked fleeing militants across state lines, coordinated ground and air assets in real time, and struck them while they regrouped. This wasn't containment. It was pursuit. And it signals a doctrinal transformation that other nations in the region are watching closely. For years, Nigeria's response to banditry in the northwest has been defined by a painful cycle. Violence erupts, the military responds, bandits retreat, and within weeks the pattern repeats. Communities are displaced, negotiations collapse, and the state's authority erodes incrementally. The fundamental problem has been one of tempo and initiative. Armed groups controlled the timing of engagements, exploiting gaps in coordination between state governments, intelligence agencies, and military commands. They operated in the seams of Nigeria's federal structure, where jurisdictional boundaries provided cover and confusion allowed them to regroup without consequence. What happened in Kano breaks that pattern. By maintaining continuous surveillance on fleeing bandits and synchronizing multiple branches of the military, Nigerian forces prevented the enemy from resetting. There was no operational pause, no safe haven. The bandits were tracked, targeted, and neutralized before they could reconstitute their capacity to strike again. This is proactive warfare, and it requires a level of technological sophistication and institutional coordination that Nigeria has struggled to sustain in the past. The fact that it's happening now raises critical questions about what has changed and whether this capability can be maintained over time. The integration of intelligence-driven operations with disciplined ground forces marks a departure from the blunt force tactics that have characterized much of Nigeria's counterinsurgency history. In the northeast, the fight against Boko Haram and ISWAP has involved heavy use of air power, armored formations, and fortified garrisons. Effective at times, but often reactive and slow to adapt. In the northwest, where bandit groups are more fragmented and mobile, the military is now demonstrating a different approach, one that prioritizes speed, precision, and the denial of sanctuary. This is where the doctrine becomes exportable. If Nigeria can prove that intelligence, surveillance, and coordinated response can dismantle decentralized insurgent networks, it becomes a model for countries facing similar threats across the Sahel. And that brings us to the broader regional context. The philosophy underpinning Nigeria's recent operations echoes a growing sentiment among West African leaders, particularly those who have come to power through military means or who govern in fragile security environments. Captain Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, for example, has built his legitimacy on the promise of unyielding action against jihadist groups, arguing that negotiation and half measures have only prolonged suffering. Whether or not one agrees with that assessment, the political reality is clear. Publics exhausted by years of insecurity are increasingly willing to accept aggressive military postures if they deliver tangible results. Nigeria's success in Kano reinforces that calculus. It provides evidence that decisive, sustained operations can work, and that hesitation is a strategic liability. But there's a critical distinction to be made. Decisive action is not the same as unchecked force. The effectiveness of the Kano operation depended not on brutality, but on precision. Intelligence enabled targeting. Coordination prevented collateral escalation. Discipline ensured that fleeing militants were neutralized without inflaming local populations or triggering retaliatory cycles. If Nigeria's military can sustain this approach, it offers a counter-narrative to the scorched earth tactics that have destabilized parts of the Sahel. It suggests that technology and professionalism, not just firepower, are the keys to winning irregular conflicts. Yet the sustainability question looms large. ISR assets are expensive. Coordination across military branches requires command structures that function efficiently under pressure. Corruption and resource constraints have historically undermined Nigeria's defense capabilities, and there's no guarantee that the lessons learned in Kano will be institutionalized across the entire theater. If this operation was enabled by temporary surges in funding, personnel, or foreign technical support, it may not be replicable at scale. Calm has returned to Kano State, not through negotiation, not through ceasefires, but because the Nigerian military refused to let bandits regroup after they were driven out. Sustained patrols, coordinated intelligence, and relentless pressure ensured that the militants who fled had nowhere to return to. This isn't just a tactical victory. It's a case study in how to consolidate battlefield success into lasting security, and it exposes the fatal flaw in Nigeria's previous approach. Winning the fight was never the problem. It was what happened afterward. For years, the pattern across Nigeria's northwest has been grimly predictable. Military forces would respond to a bandit attack, clear the immediate threat, and then redeploy elsewhere as other crises demanded attention. Within weeks, sometimes days, the bandits would filter back into the same villages, re-establish control, and resume their operations. Communities that had briefly hoped for relief found themselves abandoned to the same cycle of violence and extortion. The problem wasn't a lack of firepower or courage. It was the absence of sustained presence. Security gains evaporated because nobody stayed to defend them. What happened after the Kano operation breaks that cycle? Instead of declaring victory and moving on, Nigerian forces established robust patrols across the areas where bandits had been active. Intelligence assets continued monitoring potential regrouping sites. Coordination between ground units and air support remained active, ensuring that any attempt by militants to return would be detected and disrupted immediately. This is strategic deterrence in practice. The bandits aren't just being defeated, they're being conditioned to understand that the cost of returning is unacceptably high. The broader lesson here cuts to the core of counterinsurgency theory. Precision, coordination, and technological advantage are essential, but they're only effective if they're sustained. A single airstrike can kill 20 fighters. A week of patrols can prevent 200 from regrouping. The difference between temporary disruption and lasting security is the willingness to maintain pressure over time, and that requires resources, discipline, and political commitment. Nigeria has demonstrated all three in Kano, but the question now is whether this model can be replicated across the entire theater of operations in the Northwest, where dozens of local government areas face similar threats. This shift toward proactive security mirrors a broader recalibration happening across West Africa. Governments that once prioritized negotiation and containment are increasingly adopting postures of active enforcement. The logic is straightforward. Criminal and insurgent networks interpret restraint as weakness, and they exploit every operational pause to rebuild capacity. By refusing to grant safe havens and maintaining continuous operational pressure, states can degrade these networks faster than they can reconstitute. It's a doctrine of attrition, and it works, but only if the state has the institutional endurance to outlast its adversaries. Yet there's a critical vulnerability in this approach. Sustained military operations are expensive, both financially and politically. Troops on continuous patrol require logistics, salaries, and morale support. Communities hosting military presence need assurances that security won't come at the cost of harassment or abuse. Governors need to see tangible improvements in civilian life, not just body counts and operational briefings. If the military presence becomes a burden rather than a reassurance, local populations may begin to resent it, and that resentment becomes a recruiting tool for the very groups the operations are meant to eliminate. The success in Kano also raises uncomfortable questions about capacity and prioritization. If the Nigerian military can sustain this level of vigilance in one state, why hasn't it been able to do so elsewhere? Is Kano receiving preferential treatment because of its economic and political significance? Are resources being diverted from other theaters, leaving gaps that bandits will exploit? Or does the Kano operation represent a proof of concept that will now be scaled across the Northwest? The answers to these questions will determine whether this marks a turning point or merely a temporary island of stability in a sea of ongoing violence. What's undeniable is that the doctrine has shifted. Nigeria is no longer content to react and retreat. It's enforcing security through sustained presence, and that changes the calculus for every armed group operating in the region. The bandits who survived the initial assault and the subsequent airstrikes now face a landscape where there are no safe havens, no predictable pauses, and no guarantee that fleeing will save them. That's a strategic shift. The question is whether the Nigerian state can sustain it long enough to break the back of banditry entirely, or whether this, too, will fade as resources thin and attention moves elsewhere.